Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times, it's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time an in-depth look at figures showing the sharpest increase in absolute poverty in the UK for more than 30 years. According to official statistics, 600,000 extra people came into this category last year. And whilst rising energy prices following Russia's invasion of Ukraine are partly to blame, that doesn't tell the whole story. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the trend has been getting worse for decades. Their most recent report, published in January, outlined how current levels of poverty are around 50% higher than they were in the 1970s before Margaret Thatcher came to power. We're going to speak now to Joe Elliott. Joe is the analysis manager at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and Jospeh Howes, who is Chief Executive of Buttle UK, which provides grants for children and young people in crisis. Joseph is also chair of the End Child Poverty Coalition. Joe Elliott first from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Let's just start with definitions, because people do struggle, I think, as do I, to get their head around what poverty actually means and what absolute poverty means. Just talk us through that, please.
Sure, yeah. So we have a kind of a range of measures that we use to measure low income. The preferred measure that we use is the relative poverty measure. And what that does is it compares incomes within the year. It compares the incomes of the lowest incomes to average incomes. And a household is considered to be in poverty if their income is below 60% of the average income. We prefer that measure because it's a good indicator of what's happening across time. The government preferred measure is the absolute poverty measure, which fixes incomes at 20, 10, 11. It increases those in line with inflation, and then it compares contemporary incomes to that line. So all being well, if a society is growing, it's being prosperous, incomes are increasing, time will actually do most of the work in reducing absolute poverty measures for you. The fact that we've seen 2 consecutive years of increases in absolute poverty, this year we've seen the largest increase in the levels of absolute poverty that we've seen for 40 years, including the period of the financial crisis, with 600,000 more people being pulled into absolute poverty, is a real indictment of the inadequacy of the support government has made available for low-income families to help them cope with rising prices. So a huge increase, as you say, 600,000 more people in absolute poverty, 300,000 more of them are children in absolute poverty. So that's 1 in 4 children now living in families in absolute poverty, really just showing the lack of support government has made available to help families in the lowest incomes. In an election year, we really need to see politicians setting out their plans to address this crisis. What are they going to do to help people who are really struggling at the moment with, as you said, rising prices of energy bills and rising grocery expenses? It's not good enough in our society.
And the point is that whatever measure you use, whether it is absolute poverty, whether it is relative poverty, the fact is that the worst off members of society are growing in number and struggling as never before in modern times. I was reading through your report from January, and it talked about the numbers of people who are in destitution. This is another measure of poverty, and something like 4 million people in destitution in the UK.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's 4 million, around 4 million in destitution in 2022, and that's 2.5 times greater than the number in 2017 when we first ran the study, a huge increase. And actually, this is reflected in the government's own statistics published yesterday. So they, alongside the poverty statistics, they published figures on food insecurity and material deprivation. And we saw the number of people who were, in the government's own figures, unable to heat their homes tripled in 2022-23, driven by energy price increases from 4% to 11%. That's 1 in 10 households. Imagine walking down the street and every 10th household you see a family in there unable to heat their homes because they cannot afford their energy bills. And as well, 11% of people now experiencing food insecurity, 7.2 million people in food insecurity, meaning they're cutting back on their grocery bills, they're reducing the quality and quantity of food that they're eating. It really just isn't good enough in today's day and age that we're seeing this big increase, a really stark increase in hardship.
And Joseph, the charity that you work for, Buttle, works with children and young people in crisis, providing grants for them. Just describe to me what you're seeing on the ground.
Yeah, it's not a surprise to us at all, these figures, because let's not forget that they're for 22, 23 as well. We're kind of looking way back there as well. And from what we have seen on the ground, in that year and coming up to this year, it's going to get worse as well. The figures for next year will be worse. We support over 5,000 children and young people and their families every year. We don't actually support around things like food and support with heating. Our support is still basic essentials. It does tap into that kind of material deprivation that Joe was talking about. We provide things like a bed for children that don't have them. There are hundreds of thousands of children across the UK without their own bed to sleep in, and that surprises people still. We provide school uniforms, things like a cooker, a fridge for families, because it is more expensive when you don't have these things in your household. But we work with so many families that don't have those things. And let me just give you an example, Adrian, as well, just to kind of bring this to life a bit more. We work with a lot of families that have fled domestic abuse, for example. They're fleeing a community that they know, that they understand well, they have friends and support around them, and they have to move into a completely new area, new accommodation. It's got absolutely nothing in it. There's no cooker, no fridge, there are no beds necessarily. It is an empty shell of a place, and we provide grants directly for those children to ensure that they're not having to sleep on the floor, that they do have food to be able to be cooked to eat in the household as well. So, these figures are absolutely awful, but the experiences of people that are living through those figures essentially is harrowing.
So we've talked about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the undoubted impact that has had on energy prices, and the government points to its cost of living package to help people out with its energy bills, which they say are worth an average of £3,800 per household. But the kinds of crisis that you're dealing with, Joseph, would you say are getting worse year on year, are not really connected with that, are they? That's about the welfare safety net simply not being there. Has it disappeared? Or was it never there in the first place for the kind of families and children and young people that you deal with?
I think this is the thing. Undoubtedly, the both COVID and the cost of living crisis had a really damaging effect. But quite frankly, we were working for years. We've been working for 70 years in the UK. If we talk to the families that we worked with 10 years ago about their own cost of living crisis, they would have absolutely talked about the deprivation that they were living in at that time as well. So, yes, things have got worse over the last few years, but they've been, for the families we're working with, really, really damaging and harsh for the last 70 years. And just highlighting that, around 95% of our grants are for households of single parents. So single parent-led households. And so what we would really focus on is there more direct support that can go towards those households as well? And I'm sure I'll come to the 2-child limit shortly as well.
Well, go on, tell me about that then, because benefits at the moment are limited, aren't they? If you have more than 2 children, some support which was traditionally offered to you through the benefit system is no longer given to you. So tell me what kind of impact that's having.
That's been in place since 2017. So we're well into kind of understanding the damage that is causing children in this country. It is an absolute political decision to have that in play. We'd ask this government, any future government, to seriously remove that policy. The Conservative government that's put that in play has said that we think that every single family that's on benefits should have to make the same decisions that those that are in working households as well. That's a very broad brush, essentially, because it is implying that those that are hit by the 2-child limit don't have anyone in the household that isn't working. And we know that actually 59% of those households hit by the 2-child limit are in work as well. So it's a broad brush that's hit, and it doesn't bring in the fact of challenge. It's asking people to consider before they have children, are you able to afford those children? Things can absolutely change in people's lives. There can be bereavement in the family. There could have been disability within the children that they have. That creates more expense in the household. There's so much in this that you can't just hit it with a broad brush of, oh, well, you've got to make the same decision as anyone in a working family do.
Labour, for what it's worth, under Keir Starmer, have said that they will keep the two-child benefit cap, and some of the research I've seen suggests that families in some of the poorest constituencies in England and Wales could be as much as £3,000 a year worse off because of the two-child benefit cap. Joe, I want to talk about the historical trend here, because your latest Joseph Rowntree Foundation report talks about how until the 1980s, poverty was unquestionably a real thing in the UK, but it has become markedly worse in the decade since then, apart from a couple of brief interludes during the Blair era.
That's right. So in our latest report, we cite that it's been 20 years and 6 prime ministers since we've seen the last prolonged period of fallen poverty in the UK. And as you rightly point to, it has been largely down to cuts, caps and freezes in the benefit system that has undermined the incomes of low-income families. Just to kind of pick up on that point about the two-child limit, if we look at poverty rates for children in large families, we saw quite a substantial fall in the child poverty rate between like the mid-90s and the early 2010s. To around a third of children in large families, that's 3 or more children in poverty in around 2012. Now that's increased back up to around 45% or so. So there's been a very substantial increase. And that is really down to benefit freezes, to the benefit cap and this two-child limit that have really undermined the incomes of those families. And the government will say things like, we have made available cost of living support. And actually, the figures yesterday showed that the cost of living package held a further 1.3 million people from falling into poverty. So actually, they can show that with targeted support, they can actually prevent more people from being pulled into poverty. But even with that support, we saw the levels of absolute poverty rise. So the support obviously isn't going far enough. They haven't done enough to prevent these levels of hardship. And really, that is down to the social security system that we have in the UK not being adequate enough to hold people out of poverty whenever they fall on hard times. As Joseph says, if they end up experiencing disability and not being able to work, or if they fall sick and fall out of work, whatever the reason, the system isn't robust enough to hold them out of poverty, which is why we're campaigning for an essentials guarantee alongside the Trussell Trust, and it's been supported by a lot of charities in the sector. Even a report actually published by a select committee yesterday endorsed some of the principles of the guarantee, which means that the basic rate of benefits should be set based on a calculation of what people need to get by on. Currently, it's kind of arbitrarily set, and it's been cut and diminished over time. And then too often, it's easy to reduce that level through sanctions to the benefit levels. So really, government should commit to basing the basic rate of benefits on the kind of the calculation of a basket of goods and services and ensuring it never falls below that level, so people can always afford the very basic things we need to get by on, just like toiletries, like basic food and adequate heating.
Talk me through this historical trend, though, because it seems to me that in the 1980s, something happened in UK society so that until that point, 14% of people were in poverty. And really from the 1980s onwards, it has consistently risen, apart from these 2 brief eras that we mentioned under the Blair government, so that now, according to your figures, 22% of people, I mean, that's an astonishing figure, isn't it? More than 1 in 5 people is living in poverty. That's not absolute poverty, but relative poverty, as you define it.
Absolutely, that's right. I mean, you say our figures, we publish the figures. They're actually calculated by government as well. Government publish these figures themselves and comment on them. We just dive deeper into them. I mean, really what drives poverty is the measure we have is a relative measure. It compares to average incomes. So over the period, what drives inequalities will be increasing rates of unemployment, which we saw very dramatically through the 1980s, very high rates of unemployment, which just pulled many people below the poverty line. And then since then, the incomes of middle earners increased faster than the incomes of lower earners, and which drove high levels of income inequality between those groups, which is what kind of underpins rates of inequality, alongside changes in the housing market, more people relying on the private rented sector where costs are higher, leaving them with less income after they pay their housing costs, which is another big factor. The diminution of the stock of social housing, which helps reduce housing costs for families. There's just a huge range of different factors that play into this, but really it is just about incomes of low-income people being inadequate to get by on. And yeah, over the last decade or so, the big trend has been the cuts to the social security system that have made it the least generous it's been for 40 years. The replacement rate for benefits is the least generous it's been. That is, if you were in work and fell out of work, the average amount of your earnings you could expect to be covered by benefits is the least generous it's been in 40 years as well. So all of these trends kind of combine to mean that those on low incomes are worse off relative to the average.
I think the debate around relative poverty is quite interesting, because there are people, certainly of my parents' generation, who would say that they knew much tougher times than people perhaps experience today. And they would say that relative poverty is not a reasonable measure of poverty, because as long as you can heat your house, as long as you can eat, then from there on in, it's up to you. But two things occur to me about that. One is that many people are not capable of heating their house. They're not capable of putting enough food on the table to feed themselves or their families. But also relative poverty is also extremely important if we want a society in which all people feel that they can have a stake, and particularly children and young people can feel that they have a stake, and that they're not alienated by society and they're not excluded from playing a proper role in society.
Adrian, I was going to say as well, we look at the figures here around 4.3 million children in poverty. And these figures, they're so big. They're just, if they rise to 4.5, what does it change in the public perception around this as well? They're just so huge. And that's why we have to take it back to the experiences here as well. When you have parents worried about their children eating a good solid meal, 3 times a day, but they're also cutting out their own ability to have food, to heat their houses, to provide a bed for their children. And then you think about in that household, the high stress levels that the parent or parents are facing, that coming down into the children in the household as well, and thinking that this is just normal. This is a normal kind of way of living through, and this is life. And that is a really challenging, tough upbringing for children. And so when we all reflect on how hard is this, what's it like, whatever, and you look back to your own childhood, we would have had absolutely tough challenges, anyone does in their childhood, but where you're facing high stress in the household, every day, every year, ongoing, and the effect that can have. That's what we're talking about here in reality. It has an effect in the house and on children.
I've spoken a lot on this podcast to Professor Michael Marmot, who's done a lot of work on health inequality and the incredible variations that there are in life expectancy when you compare some of the richest constituencies in the UK with some of the poorest. And we're talking about maybe 16 years gap in life expectancy, but also an extreme variation as well in the quality of life that people live, depending on where they're raised and their levels of income and so on. And yet, as we approach an election, these stories are not a key election battleground, it seems to me, at the moment.
It's difficult, isn't it? Joe and I are talking about this, and in our sector, we see these stories all the time. Whether they have that stickability or not with the government, that's down to us to be pushing all of the time as well. I think we've really pushed the 2-child limit point. I think that is something that the parties really are thinking through. We would push them to be thinking about that a lot more. We know that in manifestos, we're expecting the Lib Dems to be absolutely advocating for that, and the Green Party to be making these changes. We push for everyone to really think about if these things like the 2-child limit are continuing to be in place, how can you talk about, okay, we're going to find solutions to this if we think about it's making work pay? There are damaging policies in place at the moment, like the 2-child limit, that you can think about other solutions. But if they're still in play, it's damaging all the time anyway. Get rid of it, make that happen, draw 250,000 children a year out of poverty immediately.
Aside from that, what are the other big structural issues, Joseph, that we need to be addressing to make sure that both children and their parents and their grandparents, because pensioners, I know, are affected by this as well. How can we make sure that this is not a persistent problem? We would go back, bizarrely, you look at the figures from the 1970s, hardly halcyon days, but to get from 22% poverty down to 14% poverty would be a massive achievement if we could even get there. How do we even get back to the rather poor position we were in the late 1970s?
It's reflecting back on what Joe said. We need a benefit system that when people are in really tough times, that's there enough to support them. And it doesn't mean that they're in deprivation. They're really sunk into poverty. That's what we need. We have piecemeal stuff around this all of the time. Some piecemeal things have really helped, like within COVID, where we had the £200 uplift for universal credit. That was fantastic in the time that it lasted, actually, and did make a difference. But it ended, and it was just a real kind of, this is something for this moment in time, and then we do away with it. So that's what we really support Buttle UK, End Child Poverty Coalition, the Essentials Guarantee, because it's actually saying we need to think about the essentials that people need in their daily lives and cost that out. We really support that.
And Joe, this isn't just about people out of work. I know Joseph has talked about people who are in work and on benefits, but we have so many structural issues within the employment market, insecurity of employment. We have people working with 0 hours contracts, for example, who may rely on the benefit system, but who are not unemployed. What are the big structural issues that Joseph Rowntree Foundation would look at and say, we need to address these so that more people are lifted out of poverty for good?
You're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of people who are actually in work on low incomes also do rely on the benefit system to top up their incomes. So ensuring that system is robust, maybe reducing the taper rate in universal credit so they can keep more of their incomes, so they face a lower marginal tax rate, as you call it, but also strengthening workers' rights to ensure people have, simple things like better notice of the shifts in advance, better rates of pay. But also it extends beyond the employment market into the housing market as well. I mentioned earlier about the private rented sector. We've seen in the latest stats published earlier this week, the largest increase in private rents on record at about 9%, a huge increase in private rents. And that obviously eats up far too much of families' incomes. The Bank of England increases the base rate to reduce inflation, and that's then translating through into much higher mortgage rates as well. So people who are buying with a mortgage are sometimes seeing their mortgage interest payments doubling or tripling, again, eating up far too much of income. So we need some structural shifts in the housing market as well as the employment market, like the building of more social rent homes to provide lower rent housing for low-income families. These big structural shifts will make a real progress in reducing rates of poverty.
Important subject, and one that we will return to here on the Byline Times podcast. That is Joe Elliott, the analysis manager at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And you've also been hearing from Jospeh Howes from Buttle UK, also chair of the End Child Poverty Coalition. I'm Adrian Goldberg. If you do want to support our work on this podcast, please think about taking out a subscription to the Byline Times. It is our wonderful monthly newspaper. You can read some of our articles online, but in the newspaper, you also get content that you can't read anywhere else. So do head over to bylinetimes.com. And if you can, please take out a subscription. As I say, it will help support this podcast too. That's over at bylinetimes.com. This has been a We Bring audio production in Birmingham. We'll see you again very soon. Thanks very much indeed. Cheers now. Bye-bye.